Imagine you're 25 years old. Yesterday, you were nobody. Today, you command 25,000 soldiers staring across a desert plain at 40,000 Persian warriors, the largest army the Sassanid Empire has fielded in a generation. Your emperor gave you 7 days to save an empire that's been bleeding for 3 decades. Every general with decades of experience says you should run. Every military manual says you're about to die. But you have a secret weapon. Not courage, not divine intervention, not superior soldiers or better equipment. Mathematics. Pure, cold, unforgiving geometry. You're about to turn this desert plain into a geometric death trap, so perfect, so devastatingly precise, that 15,000 enemies will die while you watch from a command post, calculating angles like you're solving a university exam instead of fighting for civilization's survival. This is June 6th, 530 AD. This is the Battle of Dara. And this is the day a 25-year-old kid named Belisarius proved that war isn't about who has more soldiers. It's about who understands physics, geometry, and the fundamental truth that humans are just really complicated math problems waiting to be solved. By the end of this story, you'll understand why 600 mercenaries destroyed 8,000 elite cavalry in exactly 17 minutes. Why trenches, positioned at precisely 30-degree angles, are more lethal than any sword ever forged. Why this battle you've never heard of changed military history more profoundly than Thermopylae, Cannae, Agincourt, or any famous fight they taught you in school. But first, you need to understand how catastrophically bad things were. Because the Roman Empire, or what people now awkwardly called the Byzantine Empire, because pretending it was still Rome was getting embarrassing, wasn't just losing in 530 AD, it was dying the worst kind of death. Not a dramatic collapse, with barbarians storming Constantinople's gates, a slow bleed-out, death by 1,000 cuts. The kind of death where you watch yourself deteriorate and can't do anything to stop it. For 30 years, Persian armies had been crossing the eastern frontier whenever they felt like taking a vacation. They'd burn cities, enslave entire populations, systematically destroy irrigation systems that took centuries to build, then casually stroll back home before Roman forces could even organize a response. It wasn't warfare. It was humiliation on an industrial scale. And the worst part? Rome had stopped believing it could win. That's not hyperbole. That's documented fact. Roman generals had developed what modern psychologists would call learned helplessness. They expected to lose. When scouts reported Persian armies approaching, Roman commanders retreated to the nearest fortress, locked the gates, and waited for the raiders to get bored and leave. Nobody tried to fight in open battle anymore. Nobody believed victory was possible against Persian cavalry superiority. The psychological war was over before the first arrow flew, and Persia knew it. Spring 530 AD. Let me show you exactly how bad things were with numbers that'll make you wince. In the year 500 AD, just 30 years earlier, Rome's eastern frontier boasted 42 fortified cities and a standing garrison of 60,000 professional soldiers. Tax revenue from eastern provinces funded nearly 40% of the imperial budget. The frontier was stable, defended, profitable. By 529 AD, 18 of those 42 cities lay in ruins, not damaged, ruins. The garrison had been reduced to 35,000 men through constant attrition, disease, budget cuts, and the kind of slow erosion that happens when you're losing, and everyone knows it. Tax revenue from eastern provinces had crashed by 40% because you can't tax rubble and refugees. Persian raids came annually now, sometimes twice a year. They struck deep into Roman territory, sometimes reaching within 50 miles of Antioch itself. Antioch, one of the empire's largest cities, and Rome couldn't stop barbarians from camping practically in its suburbs. Think about what that means psychologically. Imagine living in Los Angeles and watching enemy armies raid San Diego every summer while your government just lets it happen. That was Rome's eastern provinces by 530 AD. But here's what made the situation genuinely catastrophic, what the history books often miss. Every Persian raid wasn't just about immediate destruction. Shah Kavad was implementing a deliberate strategy of economic strangulation. His armies specifically targeted irrigation systems, the complex networks of canals and aqueducts that made agriculture possible in semi-arid regions. They burned crops before harvest, not after. They systematically destroyed the infrastructure that made civilization possible. Entire districts were being depopulated. Farmers were abandoning land that their families had worked for generations, because what's the point of planting if Persians will burn it in June? The military situation was even worse than the economic numbers suggested. Roman commanders, the men actually responsible for defending the frontier, had developed a culture of defeat. They expected to lose. New officers arriving from Constantinople were pulled aside by veterans and given the talk. Don't try to be a hero. Don't engage in open battle. Retreat to fortifications. Wait for the enemy to leave. Survive. That was the strategic doctrine. Survival, not victory. Persian forces owned the tactical initiative completely. They chose when to attack, where to strike, how deep to penetrate, when to withdraw. Rome simply reacted, always defensive, always passive, always losing ground. Enter Emperor Justinian, young, ambitious, probably compensating for something based on how aggressively he pursued his goals. Justinian had assumed power in 527 with dreams bigger than just not losing the East. He wanted to reconquer the Western Roman Empire that had collapsed 50 years earlier. Take back Italy from the Ostrogoths. Reclaim North Africa from the Vandals. Restore Rome to its former Mediterranean-spanning glory. Beautiful dream. Impossible logistics. Because every soldier sent west to fight Goths was a soldier not defending the eastern frontier against Persians. Every gold coin spent on Italian campaigns was a coin not reinforcing defenses against an enemy that was systematically destroying Roman infrastructure. Justinian faced an impossible choice. Pursue his Western dreams and lose the East, or defend the East and abandon his vision of imperial restoration. Shah Kavad I of Persia understood this perfectly. His spies in Constantinople, and make no mistake, Persia had excellent intelligence networks, reported everything. Justinian's Western ambitions, the depleted Eastern garrisons, the emperor's financial constraints, the psychological defeat already permeating Roman military culture. In spring 530, Kavad made his move. Not another raid, not another border skirmish, a full-scale invasion designed to permanently break Roman power in the East. He would launch the largest military operation in a generation, 40,000 warriors, representing nearly a quarter of the Sassanid Empire's total military strength. The target was Dara, the fortress city that anchored Rome's entire eastern defensive system. Think of Dara as the keystone in an arch. Remove it, and the entire structure collapses. If Dara fell, 20 surrounding cities would surrender without resistance, because there'd be no defensive depth left. The provinces of Mesopotamia and Syria would become Persian territory. Justinian would face either humiliating peace terms that acknowledged permanent Persian control, or financial bankruptcy, trying to defend an indefensible position. It was a perfect plan. Overwhelming force, 40,000 warriors against maybe 30,000 scattered Roman troops across the entire frontier. Experienced commanders who'd spent their careers fighting Romans, an enemy already psychologically defeated, expecting to lose before the battle began. Kavad assigned his greatest general to lead the invasion, Perozes, a commander who'd fought Romans for 23 years. Perozes had led cavalry charges at the Battle of Amida. He'd commanded the successful siege of Theodosiopolis. He knew Roman tactics better than most Roman generals knew, exactly how they'd deploy, how they'd retreat, how they'd die. He had never lost a major engagement against Roman forces. Never. The composition of Perozes' army was designed specifically to exploit every Roman weakness that 3 decades of warfare had revealed. 12,000 cavalry, heavily armored cataphracts on massive horses, bred specifically for shock combat. These weren't nimble skirmishers. These were living battering rams that could shatter infantry formations through pure kinetic force. Another 8,000 elite infantry professional soldiers who'd trained together for years, who knew each other's movements, who could execute complex maneuvers under pressure. The remaining 20,000 consisted of auxiliary troops, archers, engineers, support units, everything needed for sustained operations deep in enemy territory. Think about those numbers. Perozes had more cavalry than most Roman armies had soldiers total. But here's what made Persian confidence truly absolute. They had a tactical system that had destroyed Roman armies from Antioch to Armenia. It had never failed when Persians had numerical superiority. The doctrine worked like clockwork. First, cavalry probes, Roman flanks searching for weaknesses. Second, archers suppress Roman defensive fire, while infantry advances. Third, once Romans are fixed in position and exhausted, cavalry executes the killing blow, a flanking maneuver that rolls up the enemy line from the side. Simple, effective, proven over decades of victories. But Kavad had made one miscalculation, one tiny error in intelligence that would prove catastrophic. He assumed Rome's commanders were all the same, cautious, defensive, psychologically defeated before the first arrow flew. He didn't know that Justinian had just appointed a new general to the Eastern Command, a 25-year-old who'd never commanded a major army. A young officer with some absolutely insane ideas about trenches, geometry, and turning battlefields into mathematical proofs. The Persians were about to meet someone who didn't fight wars. He solved them, and his solution was about to be written in 15,000 Persian corpses. When Emperor Justinian announced in April 530 that Belisarius would command the Eastern Army, the military establishment didn't just express skepticism, they exploded in rage. 3 senior commanders, veterans with decades of experience, men who'd fought in multiple campaigns, requested immediate transfers back to Constantinople. Their official letters used diplomatic language. Their private conversations were more direct. We'd rather guard the palace toilets than serve under this child. 12 veteran tribunes submitted formal protests directly to the emperor. The complaint was always the same. This boy has never commanded anything larger than a border garrison. You're sending him against Persia's finest generals with their largest army. He's going to get everyone killed, and we refuse to die for someone's nepotistic appointment. They were absolutely right about his experience. At 25, Belisarius had served as a junior officer in border skirmishes. He'd participated in one minor campaign. That was it. Every other general commanding major armies had waited until their 42nds, had decades of campaign experience, had proven themselves through years of progressively larger commands. Justinian had just handed supreme authority over 25,000 soldiers and the empire's eastern frontier to someone who, by every conventional measure, was catastrophically unqualified. The veteran officers were right about the experience. They were catastrophically, fatally wrong about everything else. Because while all these experienced generals were out winning battles through courage and fighting spirit, and other vague concepts that sound impressive in after-action reports but don't actually explain why you won, Belisarius had been doing something different, something that must have seemed borderline insane to professional soldiers. For 7 years, this weird 25-year-old had been studying warfare like a scientist studying physics, not just reading military histories for inspiration or learning about famous generals' personalities, actually analyzing battles like mathematical problems. He'd reviewed every recorded engagement between Rome and Persia for the past 200 years, not for glory stories, for data, raw, objective data about what actually happened when specific forces met under specific conditions. He interviewed survivors from defeated Roman armies, but his questions were bizarre. He didn't ask about bravery, morale, fighting spirit, or any of the things normal commanders cared about. He asked, what was the exact distance between your formation and the enemy when they began their charge? What angle did their cavalry approach from? How many arrows could your archers fire per minute, sustained over 2 hours? At what precise moment did your line break? What was the specific trigger that caused cohesion to fail? His notebooks looked like a mathematician's homework, not a general's battle plans. Pages of diagrams showing optimal firing arcs, calculations about trench depths and their relationship to cavalry charge effectiveness, geometric proofs about angles of attack and defensive positioning. The data told him something that became his obsession. In 63 recorded battles between Rome and Persia over 200 years, Persia had won 41. That's a 65% win rate. Roman victories came almost exclusively under specific conditions, when Persian cavalry was somehow neutralized by terrain, when their numerical superiority couldn't be brought to bear, because geography channeled forces into narrow fronts where numbers didn't matter. Persian defeats happened when the battlefield negated their advantages. Think about what this realization meant. Every other general was trying to make Roman soldiers braver, better trained, more motivated. Belisarius wasn't interested in any of that. He was interested in creating battlefield conditions where bravery was irrelevant, where Persian advantages literally couldn't function, where the outcome was determined by geometry and physics before the first sword was drawn. He was thinking about war the way Isaac Newton thought about physics. If you control the variables, you control the outcome. Human courage, fighting spirit, tactical flexibility, all of that mattered, but they were dependent variables. The independent variables were terrain, positioning, fields of fire, angles of attack. Control those, and everything else followed mathematically. When intelligence reports arrived at Dara on May 15th saying a Persian invasion force was assembling current estimates 35,000 to 40,000 warriors, expected to march within 3 weeks, Belisarius's chief of staff handed him the reports with shaking hands. General, we have 25,000 soldiers scattered across multiple garrisons. Even if we concentrate everyone at Dara, we're outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Every military doctrine says we should withdraw to the strongest fortifications and wait for reinforcements. That he paused. Reinforcements that aren't coming because the emperor has committed everything else to Western operations. We're fighting in the open field. Belisarius interrupted calmly. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room thinks someone's brain just catastrophically malfunctioned. General, that's suicide. Open field battle against superior numbers? Persian cavalry will flank us, roll up our lines, destroy us in detail. Standard doctrine is why we've been losing for 30 years, Belisarius said. He walked to the maps spread across the table. Call the senior officers, all of them. I need to explain why everything they know about warfare is wrong. The meeting that followed became legendary among the men who survived Dara. 20 veteran commanders crowded into a planning room, expecting another cautious defensive strategy. What they got was a lecture on geometry. Belisarius stood before them and said, "We're going to dig trenches. Not normal trenches. Geometric kill zones, positioned at precise angles that will turn Persian numerical superiority into a fatal weakness. One officer, a tribune named Marcus, who'd fought Persians for 15 years, finally spoke. "General, with all respect, trenches are defensive obstacles. They slow attacks, but they don't win battles. The Persians will simply mass forces, overwhelm the obstacles through sheer numbers, and they'll do exactly what I need them to do." Belisarius interrupted. "Because I'm not building defenses. I'm building a machine. Every decision the Persians make will be wrong, because I've already calculated all the possibilities. The battlefield won't be where we fight them. The battlefield will be the weapon that kills them." He drew directly on the table with charcoal, ignoring the expensive maps underneath. Main trench here exactly 5 feet deep, 6 feet wide, running perpendicular to their line of approach. Not parallel, like traditional defenses. Perpendicular, secondary trenches at precisely 30-degree angles from the main line, creating wedge-shaped corridors. Do you see it? The officers stared at geometric patterns that looked nothing like any battlefield deployment they'd ever seen. "The Persians will see 3 obvious attack routes," Belisarius continued. "Each corridor appears 200 yards wide at the opening. They'll think they can overwhelm us by committing their superior numbers through multiple avenues simultaneously." "And they can't?" another officer asked. "The corridors narrow to 80 yards at our defensive line. Even if they commit all 40,000 warriors, only about 6,000 can actually engage at any moment because of the geometric constraints. The rest wait in the corridors, bunched together, perfect targets for archers, positioned on elevated ground behind the trenches, with overlapping fields of fire." The officers stared at the diagrams. One, a veteran engineer named Philippus, spoke slowly. "General, that's actually brilliant, but the engineering requirements are insane. 5-foot-deep trenches across hundreds of yards? The earth-moving volume alone, 30,000 cubic yards," Belisarius said immediately. "I've done the calculations. We have 7 days. Every soldier will need to excavate approximately 1.2 cubic yards of dirt, while maintaining security patrols, organizing supplies, and preparing for battle. It's possible if we work in rotating shifts." "You've already calculated the cubic yardage?" Philippus asked. Stunned. "I've calculated everything," Belisarius replied. "Dimensions, angles, firing arcs, probable Persian responses, casualty ratios under various scenarios. This isn't a plan. It's a geometric proof. Now here's the second part." He pointed to a hill on the battlefield map. "Even with perfect trenches, 40,000 warriors can eventually overwhelm 25,000 defenders through attrition. We need a decisive strike capability. We need cavalry that can operate independently, hit with devastating precision, and won't break under pressure. We need warriors who fight for glory rather than just money. We need horse archers who can fire 12 arrows per minute from horseback while moving at full gallop." "Huns," someone whispered. "Huns," Belisarius confirmed. 600 of them. I'll position them on this isolated hill on our left flank. To Persian commanders, they'll look like a weak point. Mercenaries separated from our main force, vulnerable to being overwhelmed. Perozes will commit cavalry to eliminate them because no competent general leaves an enemy force on elevated terrain. But if he sends enough cavalry, Marcus began. "He'll send 8,000, Belisarius interrupted. "Maybe 10,000. Overwhelming force to ensure quick elimination. And those 8,000 cavalry will charge uphill into Hun composite bows fired from elevated positions. Do you know what Hun bows can do at 180 yards from high ground?" Nobody answered. They punch through scale armor. They kill horses with single shots. And Huns can sustain 12 aimed shots per minute. 600 Huns, 7,000 arrows per minute, for 5 minutes, before they run out of ammunition. That's 35,000 arrows into 8,000 cavalry charging uphill on broken ground where they can't maintain formation. The room was silent. Officers were beginning to understand. They weren't looking at a desperate defensive plan. They were looking at a trap so mathematically precise, so geometrically perfect, that Persian numerical superiority would become their greatest weakness. May 28th, dawn. Belisarius stood on the plain north of Dara and began marking positions with stakes and rope. His soldiers, still skeptical, still scared, but beginning to believe this crazy general might know something they didn't, started digging. The main trench first, 5 feet deep, 6 feet wide, running 200 yards across the center of the battlefield. The dimensions weren't arbitrary. 5 feet was deep enough that horses couldn't jump it, couldn't cross it, without slowing dramatically. 6 feet wide meant cavalry trying to leap would fall short, crash into the far wall, create pile-ups that blocked following units. Secondary trenches next, 4 feet deep, angled at exactly 30 degrees from the main line. The angle mattered. 30 degrees created corridors that appeared passable, but compressed attacking forces into kill zones. 20 degrees would be too shallow, 40 degrees too steep. 30 was the mathematical optimum. Every measurement was verified with ropes. Every angle checked against surveyors' tools. 6 inches too wide or 3 inches too shallow could compromise the entire system. This wasn't construction. This was precision engineering under battlefield conditions. The soldiers didn't understand why the general obsessed over exact measurements. They would understand on June 6th, when Persian cavalry charges disintegrated against geometric perfection. By June 1st, the main trench was complete. By June 3rd, the secondary angles were finished. By June 5th, the entire geometric pattern was carved into the plain, a mathematical proof written in dirt and stone, waiting to be proven in blood. But Belisarius knew the trenches alone wouldn't win. They would channel attacks, create favorable casualty ratios, maximize defensive advantages. But 40,000 warriors could eventually overwhelm even perfect defenses through sheer attrition. He needed a weapon capable of shattering enemy morale at precisely the right moment. On June 4th, 2 days before the Persians arrived, 600 Hun mercenaries rode into Dara's camp under 2 brothers named Sunicus and Igan. They were expensive. Belisarius paid them 90 gold solidi per man, triple the standard mercenary rate. For 600 warriors, that meant 54,000 solidi, roughly equivalent to an entire border province's annual military budget. His logistics officer protested privately. "General, for that price we could hire 1,800 regular cavalry." "Why pay triple rate for? Can your regular cavalry destroy 8,000 Persian cataphracts while outnumbered 3 to 1? Belisarius asked quietly. The officer went silent. The meeting with Sunicus and Igan happened in Belisarius's command tent. No other officers present. Just the 25-year-old general and 2 Hun warriors who'd spent their entire lives on horseback, who could fire arrows with accuracy that Persian commanders described in their chronicles as demonic. Belisarius unrolled the battlefield maps. "I need you to understand exactly what I'm asking. See this hill? I'm positioning you there, isolated, separated from my main force by 300 yards of open ground. To every Persian commander who studies this position, you'll look vulnerable, exposed, like a mistake." Sunicus studied the terrain with predator's eyes. "You're using us as bait. I'm giving you the opportunity to achieve something no Hun force has accomplished in a century," Belisarius replied. "Destroy a Persian cavalry army. Become legends whose names are spoken from Constantinople to the Caspian Sea. If that's bait, it's the most dangerous bait in military history." Agan leaned forward. "Speak plainly, Roman. What happens? Persian cavalry will see you as my weakest point. They'll commit major forces. I estimate 8,000 riders to eliminate you quickly before sweeping behind my lines. They'll charge uphill into your arrows. If you hold that position, if you don't break when 8,000 warriors come at you believing they're about to achieve easy victory, you'll destroy the Persian right flank and shatter their morale. And if we break, Sunikas asked, then my entire left flank collapses. The Persian cavalry rolls up my line from behind, and we all die, Belisarius said with brutal honesty. I'm not going to lie to you. Everything depends on 600 warriors holding a hill against 8,000. The brothers looked at each other. Something passed between them, an understanding that didn't require words, the kind of communication that only comes from fighting together for years. Sunikas turned back to Belisarius. Roman, you don't understand, Huns. We don't flee because we're losing. We flee when there's no glory in staying. You're offering us the chance to destroy an army that outnumbers us more than 1-0 to 1. You're giving us a story our grandchildren will tell around fires. I'm offering you immortality, Belisarius said. The day 600 Huns saved Rome. Igon grinned, showing teeth filed to points in the old steppe tradition. We'll make Attila proud. One more thing, Belisarius said. Each of you carries approximately 60 arrows. That's 36,000 arrows total against 8,000 Persians. At your rate of fire, and I know Hun warriors can sustain 12 shots per minute, you have exactly 5 minutes of maximum rate shooting before you're down to close combat weapons. 5 minutes to destroy an empire's cavalry. Sunikas laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. 5 minutes? Roman, we only need 3. June 5th, evening. The trench system was complete. The army was positioned. The Huns were ready. Tomorrow, 40,000 Persians would arrive and see exactly what Belisarius wanted them to see. Elaborate defenses that looked like the desperate work of an inexperienced commander who'd read too many military treatises but had no practical battlefield experience. Belisarius walked the entire defensive line one final time. He stopped at each position, explaining to soldiers exactly what would happen. Not inspiring speeches about courage, mathematical explanations about fields of fire and angles of attack. The Persians will see these trenches and think we're afraid, he told the center infantry. They'll see defensive positions and assume we're weak. They'll charge thinking they face a static enemy waiting to be overwhelmed. What they'll actually face is a battlefield where every variable is controlled, every angle calculated, every movement predicted. You're not soldiers defending a position. You're components in a machine designed to kill Persians with geometric precision. A veteran centurion, a man named Cassius, who'd fought in 6 campaigns, finally asked the question everyone was thinking. General, what if they simply refuse to attack through the corridors? What if they mass their entire force against one section and overwhelm us through sheer concentration of numbers? Belisarius smiled. It was the first time most soldiers had seen him smile since he arrived at Dara. Then they'll spend hours forming up that massive concentration in front of our trenches while our archers shoot them at leisure. And when they finally commit everything to one point, our cavalry reserves will have all the time in the world to position for a flanking strike that hits them when they're maximally committed and minimally able to respond. Either way, attack through the corridors or mass against one point, their numbers work against them. The battlefield is the trap. Their decisions merely determine which teeth close on them. The soldiers stared at the geometric patterns carved into the plain and suddenly understood. This wasn't a defensive position designed to survive. This was a trap designed to destroy. Every decision the Persians made would be wrong because Belisarius had already calculated all the possibilities. But mathematics only works if human beings execute the plan correctly. If panic breaks the line, if discipline fails, If any unit runs before the system unfolds completely, everything collapses. Belisarius had built a perfect tactical machine. Now he needed 25,000 men to become perfect components of that machine. On the hills to the east, Persian cavalry scouts watched the Roman positions and reported back to General Persius. The boy general has dug elaborate trenches, but positioned his forces poorly. His flanks are weak. He's isolated a small mercenary force on a hill where they can be easily surrounded. It looks like amateur work, overly complicated defensive thinking without understanding how to actually use terrain. Persius received these reports with satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected. Tomorrow would be a textbook demonstration of how Persian cavalry superiority defeated Roman static defense. What neither the scouts nor Persius understood was that amateur incompetence and mathematical genius can look identical to observers who don't understand the underlying principles. June 6th, 530 AD. Dawn broke clear and cold over Dara. On the isolated hill, 600 Hun warriors checked their bowstrings, counted their arrows one final time, and waited. Each man carried 60 shafts, 36,000 arrows total. 5 minutes of sustained maximum rate fire. 5 minutes to achieve the impossible. General Persius watched the Roman positions through the morning haze of June 6th and felt deep satisfaction. He'd fought Romans for 23 years. He'd led cavalry charges at Amida that broke through defensive lines everyone said were impenetrable. He'd commanded the siege of Theodosiopolis that starved out a garrison everyone said would never surrender. He knew Roman tactics better than most Roman generals knew how they deployed, how they fought, how they died. And what he saw at Dara was textbook Roman amateur mistakes. The trenches were elaborate, certainly. Someone had spent considerable time and effort digging geometric patterns across the plain. But trenches were obstacles, not weapons. They slowed attacks. They didn't stop 40,000 warriors who could simply absorb casualties and keep coming. More critically, the Roman deployment showed fundamental tactical ignorance. The boy general had stretched 25,000 soldiers across a 2-mile front. That meant no depth, no reserves, no flexibility to respond to threats. Any competent commander seeing that deployment would immediately understand. This army is one breakthrough away from total collapse. But the most glaring error, the mistake that convinced Persius this would be an easy victory, was that isolated Hun position on the left flank. 600 mercenaries positioned on a hill, completely separated from the main Roman force by 300 yards of open ground. It violated every principle of sound military tactics. You never left a unit completely unsupported on elevated terrain where they could observe the battle but couldn't effectively participate, where they could be surrounded and destroyed while the main force watched helplessly. The boy general had apparently positioned his mercenaries where they had a good view of the battle, like spectators at an amphitheater. It was the kind of mistake officers made when they'd read military treatises but lacked actual battlefield experience, when they confused theoretical knowledge with practical understanding. Persius called his cavalry commanders together at 8 a.m. The Persian deployment was complete. 40,000 warriors in perfect formation, cavalry on both flanks, infantry in the center, support troops positioned behind the main force. The Roman center is a fortress of trenches, Persius explained. We don't assault fortresses when we have mobility superiority. We use infantry to pin their center, then cavalry sweeps both flanks. That isolated Hun position? He pointed at the distant hill. I want 8,000 cavalry to eliminate them. Overwhelming force. Quick, brutal, total destruction. Once that hill is ours, we wheel behind the Roman lines and crush them from 2 directions. A cavalry commander named Bahram raised a practical concern. "General, 8,000 against 600 seems excessive. We could accomplish the same objective with 2,000 and keep the rest in reserve for—" "We're not taking risks," Perosius interrupted. "That hill provides observation over the entire battlefield. The boy general made a mistake positioning mercenaries there, but we can't leave them in place even if they're isolated. I want that position swept clean within the first hour of battle. Use overwhelming force. Make it quick. Then we exploit." The logic was sound. The reasoning was conventional. The assumptions were all exactly what Belisarius needed Perosius to believe. Because mathematics doesn't care about experience, conventional wisdom, or tactical doctrine. Mathematics just is. And at 2 p.m., when 8,000 Persian cavalry charged confidently up that hill, they wouldn't be attacking 600 mercenaries. They would be colliding with a geometric proof about elevation, firing arcs, and the simple physics of arrows versus horses on sloped terrain. At 9:15 a.m., Perosius sent forward his first probing attack. 2,000 cavalry, charging toward the Roman right flank. Standard Persian doctrine. Test the enemy's response. Identify weaknesses. Withdraw before taking serious casualties. Quick, professional, low-risk reconnaissance. The cavalry covered 800 yards in approximately 90 seconds. 2,000 horsemen in perfect formation, lances ready, preparing to wheel away at the last moment and shower Romans with arrows from safe distance. Professional soldiers executing a textbook maneuver they'd performed dozens of times. Then they hit the trench system, and everything went wrong. Horses attempted to jump the 5-foot-deep excavations and fell short, crashing into the far wall. The neat formation disintegrated into chaos as riders piled into obstacles they hadn't anticipated being so effective, and Roman archers positioned behind the trenches with perfect fields of fire began methodically shooting into the confused, bunched-up mass. Within 5 minutes, 200 Persians lay dead or wounded. The probe, supposed to be low-risk reconnaissance, had just cost 10% casualties. The survivors withdrew in disorder. Rattled, Perosius frowned. Those trenches were more effective than anticipated. But trenches were static defenses. They didn't win battles. They just changed how you attacked. At 11 a.m., he adapted tactics. If cavalry couldn't effectively breach the trenches, infantry would. He sent forward 10,000 soldiers, a massive human wave, meant to overwhelm the Roman center through sheer mass and willingness to absorb casualties. The Persian infantry advanced in tight formation, shields raised. Professional soldiers who'd trained together for years. Roman archers fired in coordinated volleys, 3,000 bowmen, each loosing approximately 1 arrow every 6 seconds. That's 3,000 arrows per minute, 30,000 arrows during the 10-minute approach. Even with a conservative 20% hit rate, that meant 6,000 arrows found flesh before Persians reached the trenches. 6,000 casualties before swords even touched shields. Any normal army would have broken under that kind of punishment. The Persians kept coming. The first wave reached the main trench at 11:12 a.m. What happened next revealed both the genius and the limitation of Belisarius's system. The trenches channeled 10,000 attackers into 3 corridors, each barely 80 yards wide, at the Roman defensive line. That meant approximately 3,000 Persians per corridor, but only the front rank, roughly 200 men, could actually engage in combat at any moment. The remaining 2,800 soldiers in each corridor were packed behind the fighting line, waiting their turn, exposed to continued arrow fire, unable to help their comrades at the front. Persian soldiers jumped into the 5-foot trenches, scrambled up the opposite side, and emerged directly in front of Roman shield walls, positioned on slightly elevated ground. The Romans had every advantage: high ground, stable footing, shields already locked, spears angled downward. Persians were climbing off balance, shields lowered during the ascent, emerging directly into Roman spear thrusts, aimed at exposed faces and necks. But 10,000 men create their own momentum. For every Persian who fell, another climbed up behind him. Bodies of the dead became stepping stones, making the trenches easier to cross. Within 20 minutes, Persian forces had established footholds on the Roman side of all three trenches. The organized shield wall began fragmenting into dozens of individual melees. The mathematical precision that had dominated the morning started dissolving into chaos of close combat. By 11:35 a.m., the Roman center was holding, but just barely. Casualty reports reached Belisarius's command post. 800 Romans down, half dead, half too wounded to continue fighting. Persian casualties were approximately 3,000 dead or seriously wounded. The exchange ratio favored Rome, but the Persians had numbers to spend. They were rotating fresh troops to the front, pulling exhausted soldiers back, maintaining pressure that never relented. Here's where the geometric system showed its limitation. The trenches could channel attacks, create favorable combat ratios, maximize defensive advantages, but they couldn't make Roman soldiers invincible. Men got tired, shields broke, formations wavered under sustained pressure, and 10,000 Persians could grind through 8,000 Romans through sheer attrition if given enough time. Belisarius watched the center battle from his observation post. His staff officers were getting visibly nervous. One suggested committing cavalry reserves to reinforce the center before it collapsed completely. Belisarius shook his head. "The center will hold, General. If they break through, they won't break through," Belisarius interrupted. "Not because our soldiers are better fighters, because the geometry prevents breakthrough. Every time they create a penetration, the angles of the trenches funnel our reserves directly to the weak point. The system is designed to be self-correcting, but the casualties are exactly what I calculated," Belisarius said coldly. "War is mathematics written in blood. The center's job isn't to win. It's to survive long enough for the flanks to matter. Trust the geometry." At noon, 1 hour into the infantry assault, Roman casualties had climbed to 1,500. Persian casualties exceeded 4,000. The center trenches were literally filled with bodies. Soldiers were fighting while standing on corpses, slipping on blood-slicked ground, breathing air thick with the copper smell of massive trauma. The entire central corridor had become an abattoir. And then, at 12:15 p.m., Perozes made the decision Belisarius had been waiting for all morning. The Persian commander, watching his infantry stall against the Roman center despite numerical superiority, seeing casualties mount without achieving breakthrough, decided to commit his decisive weapon. He would send cavalry against what appeared to be the weakest, most vulnerable point in the entire Roman deployment. He would eliminate those 600 isolated Huns on the left flank hill. Once that position fell, his cavalry would sweep behind Roman lines and crush Belisarius's army from behind. It was sound tactics, conventional doctrine, exactly what the geometric trap had been designed to provoke. 8,000 Persian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the Sassanid Empire, began forming up for the charge that would decide the Battle of Dara. On the distant hill, Sunikas and Agan watched them come. The brothers had been waiting for this moment since dawn. They'd watched the morning's grinding infantry combat with professional detachment, conserving arrows, studying the Persian formations, calculating distances and angles, with the unconscious precision of men who'd spent their entire lives on horseback. Now, watching 8,000 cavalry forming up in perfect ranks, preparing to charge uphill with overwhelming numerical superiority, Sunikas turned to his brother and smiled. "Remember what the Roman said? 5 minutes to destroy an empire's cavalry? Aegon checked his bowstring one final time. We only need 3. The Persian horns sounded. 8,000 cavalry began their advance. The charge that would either crush Rome's left flank or become a legend studied in military academies for the next 1,500 years was underway. And the mathematics of elevation, firing arcs, and Hun composite bow effectiveness were about to collide with Persian cavalry confidence in the most devastating 17 minutes of 6th century warfare. At 2:05 p.m., 8,000 Persian cavalry began their advance toward the hill. Not a chaotic rush, but a professional advance cavalry forming up in waves, each wave supporting the one ahead, exactly as they'd been trained. This was the cream of the Sassanid military. Warriors who'd spent their entire lives on horseback, who believed cavalry superiority decided battles, who'd won dozens of engagements through exactly this kind of massed charge. They looked at 600 Huns on a hill and saw an easy, preliminary objective. A quick slaughter before the main business